The 23rd Olympic Winter Games in 2018 are awarded to the city of PyeongChang.
Mount Gariwang was home to a 500-year-old ancient forest, formerly protected by federal law from any kind of development.
가리왕산 활강 경기장의 경우도 환경 훼손은 사실은 좀 불가피합니다.
A decision was made to knock down more than 60,000 trees to build an alpine ski course for the 2018 PyeongChang Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games.
과정에서 막대한 수익을 올리려는 건설 자본들이 존재하고 그 과정에서 지역에서 이제 영향력을 계속 유지하려고 하는 지역 유지들 이 세 그룹의 담합이 분명히 존재한다고 생각하고요.
As an athlete, I don't mind criticizing because I care about it and I want to see success in the future. I want to see the IOC have success in the future, but you can't ignore that these are real problems.
They had existing ski slopes that were almost long enough. This is one of the most exasperating things about it. They just needed it to be a little bit longer, and in order to get that, they cut down a historic forest.
평창 동계올림픽 알파인 스키 경기가 열리고 있는 가리왕산 스키장에 대한 강원도의 복원 계획이 반려됐습니다.
If you're an environmentalist who attaches a lot of importance to these forests, that's gut-wrenching to watch and fairly irreversible.
지금 이래 생각하면 옛날 사진들 있잖아요. 초등학교 다니고 이렇게 뛰어놀고 하던 그런 형태가 지금 하나도 없잖아. 우선 마을 사람들이 양쪽으로 나누어졌어요.
The reason that these cases of environmental destruction are such a concern is that they are associated with multiple forms of inequality. Inequality across social classes, across countries and regions of the world, across generations, and between humans and non-humans.
It's particularly around environmental disasters when you can actually see some of these inequalities manifest themselves the most. So for example, if there's a hurricane, in fact, those who are displaced because of that disaster, those who have more resources are more likely than those who have less resources to actually come out of that okay. It's not that different in some ways than a sport mega event where you actually ask people who live in particular areas to move because of the event. Again, those who have more resources in those cases might be less impacted, might actually have more say as to how that plays out. Those with fewer resources, it might be harder. And that's certainly something that was part of the discussion around PyeongChang. This also relates to intergenerational inequalities. How is it that people 100 years from now might actually look back on the kinds of decisions that we've made? Because that is also a stark inequality associated with environmental issues. That's not at all even to mention the inequalities associated with non-humans who have no voice when it actually comes to decision making around these sorts of issues. But of course, like any form of inequality, it's not as though everybody's getting a bad deal. So there are absolutely those who benefit from the games, and there are really good arguments too why people would support the games. And I think it's also worth considering those at least on balance with the others as part of thinking through these issues.
우리 주민들이 올림픽을 유치하기 위해서 응원도 하고 추울 때도 나가가지고 염원을 많이 보여줬거든요.
There is nothing wrong that the local community desires these more savvy economic benefits through this event. One of the guests said the local Cheongsan people are really selfish. And I think it is bullshit. For the local communities, Olympic events is the single, unique opportunity.
사실 이 논쟁을 해야 되는 상대방은 올림픽을 통해서 경제 발전이 가능하다. 올림픽을 통해서 지역 발전이 가능하다라고 이야기하는 그 사람들하고 논쟁을 해야 되는데 어느 순간 시간이 지나버리면 지역 주민과 혹은 국민 전체와 올림픽을 반대하는 개인이 맞서고 있는 듯한 이제 그런 상황이 되는 것이죠.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of things that the IOC says are happening that are not happening. I think they promote the Olympic Games as a chance for cities to sort of rejuvenate themselves. It's going to bring in a ton of tourist dollars. It's going to be great for the cities moving forward. Leave an Olympic legacy.
한다니까 시골에서 반응들이 다 좋았어요. 처음부터 시작할 때부터 기대를 많이 했어요. 그분들이 아무래도 다른 데 뺏길까 봐 걱정을 우려를 많이 했죠. 개발을 했으니까 좀 더 했으면 싶죠.
So what you have is aging population who grew up during this crucial 2 decades of miraculous development. So for them, development in general is a very good thing.
평지가 됐다 이게.
국민들이 삶의 터전이
너는
넓어졌다.
커졌다. 저제 노르도 진부 30분 4개 걸리도 이제 16분이면 올라가는 거야.
Also in the most rural areas, although the country as a whole has developed a lot, there are still people that feel they want a piece of the pie because the development's been concentrated in Seoul, in the metropolitan area around Seoul, and in the southeast near Pohang, Ulsan, Busan.
Research out of the Netherlands suggests that, in that context anyway, the best way to predict whether there are good feelings about one's own national community after a sport mega event is to look at what those feelings were before the event, noting that at best, there might be a spike around an event that does not last. The same with the economic benefits. To say that there are economic benefits associated with hosting an Olympics is questionable to say the least, with high-profile politicians like Mitt Romney openly admitting that the economic case for hosting an Olympics is not a strong one. So why did some think that this was a good idea? Why were other options not used?
Well, here's the thing. It's not as though it's a secret that the IOC and organizing committees aren't highly skilled at promoting messages around how they're doing a good job around organizing the games. And that's very prominent and prevalent when it comes to environmental issues. So if you go back as far as 2000 in Sydney, when the games were promoted as the Green Games, which is sort of the beginning of a series of subsequent Olympics where there would be some grand claim associated with the games being sort of pro-environment, highly sustainable, the most sustainable ever, the greenest games ever. And you can see that actually up to now with the PyeongChang games, where similar kinds of claims are made around it being the low carbon games, the environmental games, or the O2 positive games. So again, this kind of labeling and branding of games as being sort of positive and related to something good that's associated with the environment, this is something that they're quite skilled at.
주민들이 원한다 혹은 국민들이 원한다라고 하는 이야기. 그런데 평창 올림픽이 진행되는 과정에서 국민들 혹은 주역 주민들에게 이 올림픽에 수반되는 다양한 정보들을 정말 투명하게 공개를 했는가? 근데 실제로는 가상적인 이미지만 계속 확대 재생산을 하고 있는 상황에서 국민들이 좋아하고 지역 주민들이 좋아하는 것을 왜 너네들이 반대하냐라고 하는 이야기.
Another common argument from supporters of the development was that the trees could be regrown, the mountain will be recovered, and that the damage will be reversed or be fixed.
다만 저희는 그것을 최소화하기 위해서 모든 노력을 이제 기울였고 생태 복원 차원에서 그 올림픽이 끝나면은 최대한 그 복원하려고 하는 그런 움직임을 보이고 있는 걸 알고 있습니다.
불가피한 환경 훼손을 최소화하기 위해서 노력을 많이 했고요. 그 훼손된 부분에 대해서도 계획을 수립해서 보완할 예정이 있습니다.
저희가 IOC하고 조직위에 하고 우리 정부의 그 산림청이라든가 환경청에 약속을 한 게 비드파일상에도 그 산림유전자 보호 구역 안에 그 훼손 면적 그러니까 경기장의 한 55%를 복원하기로 약속이 돼 있어요.
Many South Korean outlets have highlighted that the so-called recovery plan was flawed from the beginning. There are reports that of the 272 trees that were replanted, which by the way are replacing near 60,000 felled, have pretty much withered away already.
몇십 년이 지나고 복원이 된다 하더라도 한 번 훼손된 자연이 돌아오기란 짧은 시간 동안 돌아오지 않을 테니까.
거기서 이제 많이 활용되는 것들이 평화라든지 환경도 내세울 때도 있고, 그리고 평창 같은 경우 이번에 문화올림픽이나 실제로는 이제 대규모 문화 행사를 막 도배하는 건데 그걸 이제 문화라는 명분으로 많이 활용을 하고 이런 식으로 사실은 이제 우리 사회적으로 공감대를 얻고 많이 중요하다고 생각되는 가치들을 포장을 하는 거죠.
Ecologists have said, realistically speaking, recovery will be difficult given the extensive scope of damage. Recovery plans like these are also limited in that they only address trees felled, rather than the bigger ecosystem that was disrupted, including species that lost their homes. Of course, once the Olympics were awarded, the race was on to find appropriate venues, and Mount Gariwang was obviously a venue that fit the criteria for hosting the ski events. But were there other options that would have done the job without the environmental and social costs? The answer is a curious one.
한 7군데 정도의 장소를 환경단체에서 대안을 제시해서 다른 장소에 대해 가지고도 한 7차례 정도 그 환경단체하고 우리하고 공동조사를 실시를 했는데 그렇게 해도 유일하게 남을 수 있는 거는 중동밖에 없었다.
2번을 뛰어가지고 합산한 기록을 가지고 경기를 치른다고 했는데 올림픽에 나오는 세계 최고의 선수들한테 그렇게 한다는 건 도저히 국제 스키 연맹의 입장에서는 맞을 수가 없죠.
If we look more closely at the claim that Mount Gariwang was the only option for the ski venue, that other ski facilities did not meet the requirements, this is at best only technically true. Environmental groups suggested alternatives, only some of which required the two-run rule. One alternative was Yeongpyeong Resort, an existing ski facility less than an hour away that would have met Olympic standards with a bit of slope cutting and ground filling. Compare this slight modification to an existing facility that would have meant little environmental damage and no further displacement of people to what was needed to turn a mountain that had no development into a mountain that had one. Put another way, if we agreed that no ski facilities near PyeongChang technically met Olympic standards, why would the first option be to knock down an ancient forest on a mountain that had no development, instead of reworking an existing facility, especially when there's precedent for doing this sort of revision at previous Olympic sites?
One of the great ways to actually generate consent for a particular kind of event or a particular kind of decision that actually might be controversial is to make people feel like they've actually had a say or they can actually participate in dealing with some of the ramifications of this decision. The key here, though, is that the most contentious decision has already been made, which is the building of that stadium or the holding of these events. They call this post-politics because actually the genius here in terms of actually generating consent is to make the real decision background. That decision's already been made. Don't worry about it. But hey, you can be involved in some of the smaller decisions about actually how we're going to hold the event or how we're going to build the facility. So this is actually after the contentious politics piece, which has been sort of buried in all of this.
Of course, if we stand behind the idea that humans can fix it, then there's nothing to worry about, is there? Well, not everyone has this much faith in human innovation and know-how.
We call it ecological modernization literature and discourse. The basic premises is that environment and environmental problems can be fixed by human science and technology. So once you are convinced by that ecological modernization rhetoric, then it's easy to develop precious nature and it's easy to see these environmental problems because our cutting edge science and technology will fix it. That is the fundamental premise of this environmental modernization discourse.
Thomas Homer Dixon, professor at the University of Waterloo, in 2000 wrote The Ingenuity Gap as a way of highlighting the gap between what humans think they can do and what they have been shown to do when it comes to addressing highly complex problems full of unknowns and changing variables. What Homer Dixon shows is that the track record is at best mixed, with commentators like Naomi Klein pointing no further than the partial attempts to address the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010 that went on for 87 days and is generally considered to be the largest marine oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry. The effort to fix the leak included a junk shot of golf balls and other various apparent leak pluggers.
I mean, you can see why the sustainability approach is so appealing. I mean, if sustainability is about economics, social, and environment coming together, and you think about how this is actually operationalized when you talk about it in terms of holding a sport event or doing business, you have businesses that are motivated to create and sell green products to consumers who demand this. So you actually have this interaction that actually results in something that can be good economically. And underlying all of this is you're actually doing things that are good for the environment. Who can't be for that? Of course, there are problems with this in the sense that businesses, while they are motivated to create green products, in some ways, what they're really motivated to do is reach their bottom line. This is where greenwashing comes in. It's not to say that there aren't excellent businesses out there that are doing pro-environment work, but the incentive system isn't necessarily lined up perfectly for this to take place. And we do know that one of the ways that sustainability as a concept is exploited is prioritizing economic sustainability. So although it is a really compelling storyline, and one of the things that makes it compelling is it's as though we can all be winners in this. We can all keep generating products because we're going to be innovative in doing so. It's going to make us money, it's going to be good for the environment, and it's good for people. Not everybody actually agrees that it plays out that way, so maybe we're not all winners.
People often ask, what's the alternative to a sustainability approach? One response to that is to not hold the games if it's not sustainable enough. While that's not really an alternative to sustainability, it is a commitment to truly doing sustainability that prioritizes environmental and social issues in addition to economic ones, and also not leaving it to the IOC to decide for a community about what is sustainable enough. Another strategy is to put more time into thinking about what an alternative actually looks like for one's community, instead of focusing only on how to execute a conventionally sustainable games that are often, in fact, not always citizen or environmentally friendly games, and may in fact benefit only some businesses and not others, and not all cases for governments either for their bottom line.
평창 올림픽까지 실패가 예상되는 이 상황에서도 그것 자체를 은폐하고 계속 이렇게 밀어붙일 수 있는 그런 공모관계가 있다고 생각합니다. 그래서 사실 그 과정에서 실제적으로 제일 피해를 보는 사람들은 대중들, 현지 주민들, 뭐 가리왕산 같이 이런 우리가 사회적으로 지켜야 될 중요한 가치들 이런 것들이 많이 희생을 당하는 수밖에 없는 상황들이라고 생각을 하고 있습니다.
If we consider that PyeongChang and the South Korean government had a vested interest in defending their decision to develop Mount Gariwang, it becomes easier to understand why voices against the development had trouble breaking through.
It's not as though many journalists, activists, and others actually haven't articulated some of the really important and compelling critiques. So if we're actually wondering why some of the critiques might not be taken up, it might be simply because they're buried in a broader landscape where there are more powerful messages out there. And this has very little to do with whether the messages that are more prominent are actually better reasoned than the critiques. It's simply about the variety of sources that are producing messages and how powerful those messages are. It's actually thinking about the context within which these messages move.
So why did they do this? There were options besides Mount Gariwang for the ski venue that would fit all of the IOC's criteria with only minor changes, but they were not chosen. How can we explain this? To be clear, we don't know for sure. Explaining why powerful decision makers make the decisions they do requires behind closed doors knowledge which we're not privy to. But let's take a look at what we do know. According to investigative reports, an unnamed CEO of a South Korean construction company owns about 132,000 square meters of land around the base of Mount Gariwang. That is, the location of the eventual finish line for the alpine ski course. Records show that this individual has been buying land here since 1998, and in 2001, this individual suggested Mount Gariwang as a potential alpine venue site to the bidding committee for the games, and was present for many of the committee's site visits. This individual was not the only one highly invested in the area. Since 1999, when there was talk about hosting the games here, over 75% of all land sold has been to those living in or near Seoul, the capital city of South Korea, and not the locals. There were other interests too.
Local politicians generally see it as good points on their resume to introduce a big project, a development project. With the PyeongChang Winter Olympics, you've got that on the national scale, also got it on the local scale. You know, PyeongChang won it. So that's brownie points for the officials at PyeongChang County, Gangwon province level, as well as the national level.
You wouldn't be surprised to know that government officials and organizing committee members have a vested interest in looking good when it comes to portraying what they're doing. And certainly this is the case when it comes to one of the more controversial issues often around games, which is asking people or requiring people to move from their homes for the building of a venue. And while that might be portrayed in some cases, and certainly this was the case with PyeongChang, as a situation where this was actually going to improve people's lives, make things better, there is research out there that would actually suggest in some cases that that's not exactly the case, and it might even be the opposite. Jackie Kennelly, someone who has studied this specifically when it came to Vancouver and London, and what she found was that if you actually asked people on the ground, you would hear a different story than you might hear from what's portrayed by the Games Committee.
그분들은 만족이죠. 지금 그분들은 아무래도 뭐 보상받고 글로 올라가가지고 또 이게 저 개발이 되다 보니까 이제 또 이 땅값도 좀 많이 오르고 이래서
일 보던 사람들이 너무 욕심이 많아. 마을을 위해서가 아니고 자기 자신들의 욕심을 위해서 일을 했던 것 같아.
Unsurprisingly, there are other important details about relocation that were not highlighted by PyeongChang. For example, although landowners were compensated to relocate, it was generally not enough to allow for the purchase of new land or the building of new homes. Many had farmland in their backyard from which they made a living, and this land is now gone.
이주단지가 조성을 했는데 거기 남아있는 가구는 10가구인가 11가구 사라진 거예요. 사라진 거는 뭐 쫓겨나기도 하고 다 이제 할머니 할아버지 분들이었으니까 자식들 집에 가기도 하고 아니면은 그 보상비를 받아가지고 그 정선 알파인 경기장 그 인근에 있는 교회 지역에 그 새로 집을 얻기도 하고.
나은 올림픽을 만들 수 있는 기회마저 얘네들은 놓치고 있는 건가 아니 외면하고 있는 건가라는 생각이.
There are larger challenges here pertaining to democracy and multiple forms of inequality that extend far beyond sport and the Olympics and far beyond the geographical boundaries of South Korea. One of these challenges is to rethink dominant paradigms like sustainability, as in, can we get past assuming that an equal balancing of environmental, social, and economic concerns is always desirable or even possible? The creative momentum and energy that's most often put into promoting a taken-for-granted approach like sustainability could be put into organizing the Games that has immense integrity when it comes to addressing social and environmental concerns. Looking to the future, it's important to remember those who've raised their voices about these issues, like those around Mount Gariwang. Although these activists are sometimes remembered only for having failed to stop Olympic-related problems, it's important to also remember that they were often very successful in raising awareness about what happened and reminding us that what happened around Mount Gariwang is not an isolated incident. In this way, we might learn from the work of those who stood up against the development of Mount Gariwang and be inspired to do something differently in the future. And in some ways, there's never been a better moment to do something differently, because we now know the questions we need to ask about hosting the Games. Questions like, do we need the Olympics to achieve the environmental, social, and economic benefits that the Games promise? Do all stakeholders in the Games have enough information about the problems and benefits of the Games to make a proper assessment? Who has the least powerful voice and how can they be heard? How can the interests of non-humans be included? And what would it take for all stakeholders to agree that the Games are too unsustainable to go forward? Of course, broader questions about how to address climate change have never been so prominent on the global agenda. Why shouldn't discussions about the Olympics be in step with talks about the future of our planet? There's also never been a better moment for Tokyo, for Beijing, for Paris, and for LA to imagine a Games that is, in fact, much more environmentally friendly. The opportunity here is not just for the organizers, but for all stakeholders to learn from the past, to honor the work of those before, to imagine a world where social and environmental justice actually take precedent over a mega event.